Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Archaeology of Connecticut, powered by the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. This is Dan Forrest, co-host, and joined by our brand new shiny penny state archaeologist, Sarah Sportman, and a special guest from the State Historic Preservation Office. So, Sarah, can you say hello to the audience?
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to this month's episode, and we're here today with Cathy Labadia, who's the staff archaeologist and deputy State Historic Preservation Officer at the State Historic Preservation Office in Hartford. And we're going to talk a little bit today about that office and what it does and how it's involved in the archaeology in Connecticut.
Well, hello, everybody. It's nice to be here with you both today.
Thank you very much for joining us, Cathy. So can you tell us what the State Historic Preservation Office is and what work you do?
Certainly. So the State Historic Preservation Office was actually created through federal legislation. And not to bore your listeners too much, the act that created it is the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. It was a law that came out at a time when a lot of environmental laws were being passed because people were becoming nostalgic about what had been lost through interstate development, the urban and suburban sprawl that was happening. And so this was the federal response to that nostalgia. And what that act really set up was a federal commitment that says we care about the direction of our country and we care about what has been here. And in that act, they created something called a historic preservation program. And the responsibility of our office is to carry out that program. And so we do receive special federal funding to help carry that out. And it includes things such as creating a certified local government program for municipalities to be committed to historic preservation, reviewing historic tax credits for historic buildings, conducting regulatory review through the implementation of Section 106, and a variety of other tasks just to promote and get people to care about historic preservation. So we are one of many offices. Each state is required to have one, as well as the U.S. territories, if they want to receive federal funding, because there is no way for a state to meet their federal requirements without having a state historic preservation office to turn to.
So for archaeology, am I correct that the majority of the work that you do as the staff archaeologist, a lot of that is in what we call environmental review, or that sort of regulatory process?
Yes, I would say that it definitely takes up the vast majority of my time. And so while our office is set up under a federal umbrella, we also have state responsibilities to conduct these environmental reviews under the Connecticut Environmental Policy Act. So when somebody is receiving either federal or state funding, or they somehow require an approval or a permit or other type of authorization, that project has to be submitted to our office for a review. And that's what we call the environmental review. And as the only archaeologist on the staff, anything will come to my desk that involves even the most minimal of ground disturbance to determine whether or not there should be a recommendation for an archaeological survey.
And so our audience is more familiar with the state archaeologist and what the state archaeologist does to identify, protect, and research the archaeological sites. But the reality is that that sort of public function of the state archaeologist in some way can mask all of the hard work that the State Historic Preservation Office does to identify and protect sites. And the interesting thing about Connecticut is because those two offices are distinct, whereas in other states where there is a state archaeologist, that individual often works within the SHPO's office. Do you think that that sort of unique history in Connecticut, or unusual history in Connecticut, and that division of labor has affected the way you approach your responsibilities?
So there are benefits and there are drawbacks. The benefit is that our state has made a commitment to archaeology, to me, that is extremely meaningful that, we have doubled up on that effort, and it really shows a commitment from the government that we care about this. And so I think that's a very meaningful thing. Second, the tasks are just, to the idea that I would have to do all of this myself. There's many days where I go home feeling like I was ineffectual today, and I cannot imagine if one person had to do all the job duties of both offices. And so the other benefit that comes from that is that we're able to have a greater impact by being able to divide up some of those responsibilities. The difficulty comes in terms of public perception and understanding of where to go and who to turn to when they have questions. The other difficulty is that sometimes you have to move so fast that you don't realize that the other office has maybe already picked up a piece of this. And, for myself personally, in discussing this with Sarah yesterday, I said, well, I'm the archaeologist that has to be in the box. I have very strict legal requirements that I work within, which sometimes is very helpful in dealing with developers and municipalities about, you must do this. Whereas, I sometimes get jealous of the state archaeologists and the flexibility that they have. And, I'm not going to lie. I listened to a bunch of the episodes today and I thought, oh, I know that project because I told you have to dig there. And, oh, I know that project because I told you. And not in one episode was there any discussion of, well, SHPO made that recommendation. Or actually, there was one episode where there was.
It is really it's much harder, I think, because the SHPO's work is less public in some respects. It's much harder for people to understand exactly how that process works, and you talk about the enormous workload, and that's absolutely true. Can you give our audience a sense for what that actually looks like for you on its sort of day-to-day basis?
Sure. So I will tell you right now, we are supposed to, in our federal requirements, we have a 30-day review frame. And it is a struggle to keep up with that. So I can say that right now on my desk, I have 70 reviews that I need to immediately get out this week. Our office, as the total environmental review group, which is 3 people, myself and 2 architectural historians, we review approximately 3,000 projects a year. And when I tell people that, they're always astounded by it, just because you don't realize how much activity is happening in this state. And those projects can range from, a very small footprint of a cell tower to statewide road improvements or pipelines. So even when you look at the totality of the projects, there's 3,000 of them, just one of those projects, such as the I-84 viaduct improvement, that takes up an enormous amount of time over multiple years. So it's only counted as one, but the effort that I'm putting into it might be equal to another 500 of something smaller.
I used to use the analogy all the time it's a dated reference, but I Love Lucy. There's a very famous episode where they're working in the chocolate factory and trying to keep up with the conveyor belt. And you very quickly realize that is a perfect analogy for what many weeks on end can feel like in the office. And the risks, and it's very difficult because you have so little time to focus on things, there's always a risk you miss something important. And that, if you're not concerned about that, you're not doing your job, but it's easy to let that consume you as you're sort of going through this. As you're sort of thinking, you've got a brand new partner here with Sarah, and the new opportunities to sort of shift things around or make tweaks to the way that you have worked together in the past. Are there, particular ideas that you're drawn to? Concepts that you think the two of you are going to pursue?
So my first thought when you said that was, I'm going to lie to Sarah right now and tell her she has all these responsibilities that she doesn't. But the reality is I would never want to also scare her away from the position. And, as crazy as it sounds and as overwhelmed as I am from day to day, I love what I do. And so I've always compared it more to a MASH episode. So I frequently talk about, these are in triage, stat, I need help over here. And so I tend to use a lot of that ER, environmental review, or emergency room type language. I've been in the unusual position of being the staff archaeologist when Nick Bellantoni was still here, and that was one relationship. And I think his relationship was, more set in stone from the predecessor that we both had at SHPO. And then I had the opportunity to work with Brian, who I can't think of a more out-of-the-box archaeologist. And so even though I made recommendations or, wanted to work with him on things, they either soon became his idea or he went in a completely different direction. But always enjoyable. And so now with, Sarah coming aboard, I love what I do in this I was a born bureaucrat, and I'm happy doing that. But I would really just want to support Sarah in what initiative she would want to take moving on. And there are certainly gaps that I see, and I would like to talk to her about. But it's really what she's most comfortable doing.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds great, and I'm sure that, as time goes by, we'll work out a kind of productive relationship for how we want to, put things together. I mean, on my side of the equation, I think that, the state archaeologist has an important role in not just bringing archaeology to the public, but also filling in the gaps in the review process where projects fall through the cracks in terms of not being under state or federal regulations, right? The projects that happen at the municipal level. So it's my job to deal with projects at the towns.
Right, and I think, to pick up on Cathy's comment about you're in a box, but you have firm rules around the work at the State Historic Preservation Office. So much of what the state archaeologist does is asking people to do the right thing. And with 169 municipalities in the state and a complete allergy to any sort of regional coordination, there is there's a particular challenge in trying to do that and not just raise public awareness, but help people recognize the value of archaeological resources when they don't have explicit protections. And so it is very much a different balance point, I think, for the state archaeologist. It has been.
Yeah, I think it's more of a negotiation kind of process where, convincing people about the importance and the significance of these resources, but also doing the best job that you can to facilitate the development that needs to happen within the context of the project. So, the idea is to work with the towns and work with people, to come up with a solution that benefits both sides.
Mm-hmm. Even in what we do, Dan, as you know, even though the mandates are stronger from the statutes and legislation, it's still always a negotiation. Nobody wants to do this. Nobody sees the value in it, especially when they're up against time and budget constraints. And so there's always that level of negotiation that goes on with, how do we balance this cultural environment against the needs of the public or an individual developer.
And I do think for both offices that can become acute, because if you are laser focused on just your lane, it is very easy to miss the public good that a lot of these projects directly serve. And I can certainly recall many times feeling that conflict directly, where it is really important to pay close attention and protect the historic properties, whether they're above ground or below ground. Mm-hmm. But there are very important projects that need to go forward, or there's very bad things that can happen to a lot of the population, particularly at-risk members of our communities. That's something that it's very difficult to prepare for. And I think there's a very different perspective you have when you become a public servant. That if you take that seriously, you're forced to at least consider that balance as part of the discussions. And it makes things more complicated, but I think complicated in a way that it really should be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And, and then you sprinkle in with that, I always discuss my day as being mostly what I have to do, and then some of the things that I want to do. And, so when you said, well, what are your responsibilities? I mean, the environmental review eats the most of my time, but what I love doing is dealing with the public. pursuing other interests either within the Archaeological Preserve program, which I think is phenomenal, and I'm very thankful we have a state that has that. Recently, team wrote a grant for the American Civil Rights regarding the Martin Luther King connection in Simsbury. So we have a grant to put together some National Register nominations for that. And recently teamed up with the town of Ridgefield to put in American Battlefield Protection Grant. So, sometimes the things that keep you going, the negotiations and all those things that really weigh you down and you feel like you're always battling and there's no wins. Every day I try to take the time out to think about all those want to things and add them into my day.
Yeah, and I think another really important thing to keep in mind is just that for all of the kind of tedious regulatory aspects of these jobs, I mean, these are the projects and the types of things that actually facilitate archaeology. This is how archaeology gets done, how most archaeology gets done. And if we didn't have these projects and these processes, we wouldn't have the archaeology that we've had in the state and the really incredible discoveries.
Yeah, and to sort of put this in a slightly bigger context, for 25 years, there were literally only 2 archaeologists employed by the state of Connecticut as archaeologists. There are quite a few other archaeologists working in jobs completely unrelated to our field, but there were 2. And it wasn't until roughly 15 years ago that number grew slightly. So the Connecticut Department of Transportation has an archaeologist now, and that was a 10-year negotiation to get that position as well as an architectural position created within that department. There was a very brief window where SHPO had 2 archaeologists. But, unfortunately, it didn't last terribly long. But that's not true for many other states. So in many other states, there are 2 or 3, or in some cases 5 or 8 archaeologists working within the State Historic Preservation Office. And, for the state archaeologists, it also can be a challenge where the office is really fundamentally supported by the Friends group. The Friends of the Office of State Archaeology is a critical part of the success of the state archaeologist because there is minimal staffing, there's minimal financial support for infrastructure within that office. So it is an agency that relies on volunteers to an absolutely enormous degree. All of those pieces, it feels like a patchwork at times, have to sort of mesh together into some effective safety net and advocacy sort of network for protecting and recognizing the value of archaeological sites. That piece of it is one of the things that certainly I struggled with at times, and in particular, we've talked about this on a couple of episodes of the show, our real need to sort of protect the locations and in some cases the types of archaeological resources that have been identified in Connecticut, because there's a very real risk that somebody will loot or vandalize or destroy those sites if those locations are known. That makes it exceptionally difficult to get the public involved and appreciate and invested in preserving the very places that we're so concerned about. Is that a struggle that you both feel, or do you see it in different terms, in terms of trying to maintain obscurity as well as let the public know what these places are and why they're important?
So I think for myself, I've never struggled with it as much as you're describing, and it's always because I've felt that when the public is informed of something, it helps to make them care about it. And that when somebody recognizes how valuable in an intangible way something is, they become better stewards of it. And so the beauty of Connecticut is we actually have a pretty rich archaeological heritage. And so it gives us the opportunity to openly share a lot of sites, to get public sentiment on your side and encourage people to care about our history. And there are a handful of sites that I know of that I would never tell anybody about. That I do think there is no benefit to share them when we have equally as interesting sites that the public, can be involved with. So I've kind of always developed the balance in a way of like, they don't have to know. There's not everything you need to know, but here's enough to give you a sampling of what's out there and why you should care about it. The other thing that I've noticed is looters are better archaeologists than most archaeologists I know. And, so I know that there's been a lot of talk about, gut feelings, and I've never looked at it that way. It's about the education and training that we've had and the experiences where we know where the sites are, we know how to find them, we know what the appropriate methods are. That's what makes us, such a highly educated profession. And looters acquire that knowledge through experience also. And so as I always tell people, I've never had a looter come to my office to look at archaeological sites to find a place to dig. They know where to go. They know where the protected spots are. And it is unfortunate. And what I think about more is how do we protect those sites that are a target for looters?
Yeah, and I think that, in general terms, you can talk about these archaeological sites without, necessarily giving away exact locations. It doesn't preclude you from discussing the sites, discussing their significance, discussing the materials that are found. But bringing archaeology to the public, like Cathy was saying, and making people understand its significance and making them care about it also makes them better stewards of the resources in and around the areas where they live, where they're more likely to come forward and say, hey, someone's been messing around, in this area, and I know that there's a site there. So that's another important piece of the puzzle that, us talking to the public and sharing this information makes them partners in preservation.
So I would make just one quick point for why I think this challenge can be very tricky. So for many of the projects that we're looking at, if there is, say, a prominent historic house that is threatened and that may be knocked down, that is very often appropriately a focus of discussion. And members of the public know beforehand when that property is threatened, and there's an opportunity for them to effectively weigh in. Whether they believe it's important or not, there's transparency in terms of what is at risk. For the archaeology, that is very rarely the case, other than in quite abstract terms. That does limit, in really substantive ways, the public's own capacity to sort of engage in that discussion when decisions are being made. And I think for that reason alone, it's fundamentally different between the different types of historic resources that we're balancing. And I don't think there's anything new, but it is something that affects the way that the public understands archaeology and their ability to really understand in more detail what's all around them.
So that is one of the reasons why I enjoy working with my colleagues so much. Working in an office of full architectural historians every day, the view on preservation, how they handle preservation, how they involve the public is entirely different from the way archaeologists traditionally go about it. And in my critique in archaeology in this point would be the way the pendulum is swinging now. We have been very protective of our data. We have been very possessive over it and unwilling to share stories, and sometimes still tell stories for people that we probably shouldn't have done. So I would like to think that pendulum is swinging, and that our responsibility to share, to get people motivated to action, that's where we should be now.
So you mentioned the State Archaeological Preserve program, and I think that's probably a great illustration of the point you're making. So, and this is a program that is really co-managed by the State Archaeologist and the State Historic Preservation Office. So can you introduce our listeners to the State Archaeological Preserve program?
I would love to, and you might have to keep me quiet after a few minutes. In terms of when I think of how our offices work together, this is probably one of the best programs, and not even just within our state, but when I, look across the country in terms of other states that have a similar program, we really stand out in this. So the Archaeological Preserve program is an opportunity to basically allow for the permanent preservation for an archaeological site. And this happens by first identifying the site and its significance, and it's evaluated in terms of the state or national register. There's these criteria that we look at for how this state contributes to our history, and really does it rise to the level of importance for this type of a special designation. Once it passes that first threshold, the next important thing is that a rider or an easement is put on the land deed that permanently establishes this location as one that their ground disturbance cannot happen unless they consult or work with our office first. And what has really come out of this preserve program is a partnership with everybody who we work with, and it can happen on both public and private lands. But people who maybe have an excellent site on their property and they're getting older and they know they're going to sell the property off, and they say, you know what, we want to be able to pass down a history that we've been taking care of. And this is an opportunity to do that. And it creates a relationship with our office, with the Office of State Archaeology, for technical guidance, advice, ways to take care of this particular parcel of land and site.
Who nominates the site?
So anybody can.
And is it like the Hall of Fame where you get like 3 or 4 cracks at it, three or four submissions year after year?
If you need that many cracks, yes.
Well, it's just sometimes discovery is in your field. Discovery happens all the time. So you may learn a nugget
Yes.
2 years later that says, hey, we got to put this site up for it one more time.
Yes. Yeah, that definitely happens. And even just our attitudes towards what is important or what we value, our changing philosophies of what parts of history are, just recognizing, particularly disenfranchised communities, that, maybe 20 years ago we didn't even identify those are important or significant things.
So how many sites do we have right now that are protected like that?
Right now we have 32
in
Connecticut.
Are we doing well with 32?
I think we are. So it goes through periods of there will be a lot of activity and things moving, and then it might be stagnant for a while. But that, when you think about in our state and the pace of development we have, and the number of government adverse people that are out there, to have permanent preservation easements over 32 parcels of land, I think it's impressive.
Well, if you're like me and you just couldn't hold it any longer, and you had to jump into asking a question, you're allowed to. That you can go old school, use a phone, 860-526-4278, 860-526-ICRV, or you can send in a comment or question into info@icrvradio.com. That's info@icrvradio.com. Or, depending on how you're listening to us, browser-based or app-based connectivity, the page that is on your screen has a share block right there. You can type into that share block, and that goes to us as well. So send in any comments, questions. We have Archaeology of Connecticut is going to continue, but first we're going to take a little pause in the action and hear from our supporting sponsors. More right after this. On view now at the New Britain Museum of American Art is For America, paintings from the National Academy of Design, featuring over 90 works by members of the National Academy of Design, including Thomas Eakins, Winslow Homer, and Andrew Wyeth, along with masterworks from the Hudson River School and American Impressionism. For more information, check out nbmaa.org. That's nbmaa.org. See more at the New Britain Museum of American Art, where art meets life.
Come to Hillstead Museum in Farmington, Connecticut to experience art and culture in a magnificent historic setting. A visit to Hillstead Museum unlocks a 1901 architectural treasure. French Impressionist paintings, Ming Dynasty Chinese porcelain, Japanese woodblock prints and period furnishings. Enjoy a guided tour with interpreters who have the inside scoop on the family that created this landmark. Take time to experience the tranquility of Hillstead's sunken garden, or take in surrounding vistas of the Litchfield Hills while sitting on the Mount Vernon-inspired veranda. There is something for everyone at Hillstead in Farmington. Bring your friends and family to one of our many public programs, such as the Sunken Garden Poetry Festival, May Market, Heyday, or Holiday Boutique. Find a complete schedule of events at hillstead.org. Visit Hillstead Museum to take a step back in time, explore nature, or marvel at world-class artwork by Monet, Degas, Cassatt, Manet, and Whistler. There is so much to discover only at Hillstead. Please visit hillstead.org.
Welcome back to the Archaeology of Connecticut, powered by the Friends of the Office of State Archaeology. I'm Sarah Sportman, the Connecticut State Archaeologist, and I'm here today with my co-host Dan Forrest and our special guest Cathy Labadia from the State Historic Preservation Office. She's the staff archaeologist there, and we're talking a little bit about that office and how it functions within the archaeology of Connecticut.
So, Cathy, there's always those risks we talked about of getting things right or getting things wrong, or even potentially not being able to convince somebody that there is an important archaeological site at risk for projects that your office is working with. What do you feel is the biggest sort of loss, whether it's a loss of an argument or you just ended up on the wrong side in your review?
So I will say we have been really fortunate to have some great archaeology going on in the state. And, I know your listeners have heard about the Paleo-Indian site in Avon, the Webdeen-Stevens early European settlement. Both of those came out of environmental reviews. And what is great about finding sites like that is it makes people interested in archaeology. And so both of those particular programs, what has been good about them is, for example, the Avon site was an initiative by the Department of Transportation. Now, when I go to talk to the Department of Transportation about needing to do archaeology, I don't get a lot of blank faces in the room or, oh, wow, I really don't want to have to do that, because it turned into such good publicity. And, everybody likes to see their name in print, so they're actually kind of excited to do archaeology now. The only problem is not every site turns out to be the oldest site in Connecticut. So those have been some real wins and have really helped the argument. The sad thing that you don't want to talk about are the losses. And, this gets back to the idea of where it is always a balance. And sometimes that balance becomes looking at archaeological sites and knowing when it's time to lay down the gauntlet. Like, what are you really willing to put your reputation on the line for? How long are you willing to push or, try to preserve this particular item? And I think that on the archaeological side, we've actually had slightly more success. Some of the projects at our office that we've been involved with that speak to the larger role of SHPO that I get regretful about are, for example, when we were involved in the battle of saving the Brown houses at the University of Connecticut. And for anybody who is unfamiliar with that, let me tell you a little bit about it. The University of Connecticut campus is actually a designated National Register historic property. And there were 6 faculty houses that were built in the campus, and in order to build their new recreation center, they needed to clear out space to use as a staging area. And so, part of me is, when you think about that, they tore down Paradise to put in a parking lot, that is literally what it was. Yeah, it's good too. But that is really what happened there. They took these buildings down simply so they could use it as a storage facility. So, first your heart breaks as to, do you know what you're taking down? And sometimes you can become passionate about things and that you lose sight of how to do the negotiation. And so in that particular case, what really stood out to me for that project is UConn was a land grant school. It was designed by a famous architect. And then he came across and he met another famous architect, a landscape architect called Frederick Law Olmsted. And what really happened there is he said, you're building this Gothic, monumental architecture, and what people really need is a place to connect. That there needs to be a different way that we think about higher education and the institution. And so there, the influence of Frederick Law Olmsted on this other famous architect, you see his hand because he creates this little enclave of these 6 residential buildings in the middle of what is otherwise a lot of Gothic architecture. And so it really stands out of how the work of one master could have influenced something else. So these buildings were not just important because of the way that they looked and the way they were built. It was really because you see this influence there, and it tells a piece of history of how our minds are changing about how we look at design and how it influences education. And sometimes you get so caught up in the argument of why something is important that you don't spend enough time understanding the needs of what are happening, and you get so caught up in the passion that you lose your ability to negotiate. And so for me, that is always the hard thing, is balancing those. And that was a huge loss.
Hey, we should say that the listener just sent in a question. I'm listening live to Archaeology of Connecticut. I have a question for Sarah, Dan, and Cathy. What are your favorite dinosaurs? And do you ever find them in Connecticut? So now they're putting you in the position of you got to be fans of an era, and then you have to put your archaeologist hat on as well.
Oh, this is a complicated question for me. I have a 6-year-old who is completely obsessed with dinosaurs and is hugely disappointed that I never find any when I go into field work. He's obsessed with Tyrannosaurus Rex, as to be expected, and that is probably the dinosaur that I know the most about now as a result of that. But unfortunately, I've never found one because they didn't really live here.
So, as state archaeologist, you are going to get more questions about dinosaurs than just about anything. It is funny. The Connecticut actually does have some very famous, particularly dinosaur tracks, but also fossil beds. And every once in a while, our paths cross with the paleontologists and geologists who are actually trying to protect those. There are a number of fairly famous, let's say, cultural landmarks in the state. Buckland Hill Mall is one of them. When constructed in those brown sandstones, there were a number of fossils. And so some of the unusual, let's say, entrance ramps to the parking lots on there are structured the way they are to try to preserve some of those dinosaurs that are encountered. So working in the regulatory side, every once in a while you bump into those circumstances, and certainly there are a number of other properties around Dinosaur State Park where both the archaeologists and the geologists are working together to try to preserve important places.
That was a nice dodge. You wait not to answer the question.
Oh, what's your favorite dinosaur? Come on, Dan.
Yeah, well done. Okay, that's great. Now answer the question.
Ankylosaurus.
That's a good one.
So I work with a staff of architectural historians who think that it's hilarious to ask me dinosaur questions all day. And I am fairly certain that one of them has submitted this question to you tonight. So I try not to engage them or entertain these questions, but, more make a disgruntled face and say that is not what an archaeologist does. But in the spirit of fun, I would pick Archaeopteryx, because I remember as a young student, learning about it and the professor saying, now if you look outside and you look at a bird, that's the closest living relative to the dinosaurs, and this is the fossil that proved it. When I was a student as an undergrad, I took an intro to archaeology class, and one day was set aside for teaching what was called cocktail archaeology. And it is probably the class that stuck with me the most. And what the teacher did, Dr. Kenny Fader, who I think was on a few weeks ago, is he said, inevitably, you will go to a cocktail party And everybody will say to you, "Oh, so what do you do?" And he says, and you'll say, "An archaeologist." And they will want to talk to you because it'll be a room full of accountants and lawyers. And who wants to talk to them? And he said, and then the conversation will quickly turn to things about archaeology, questions about Egypt, question about ancient aliens. And there was a list of 10 items that he said, "I'm going to teach you a little bit about all of these so you can have cocktail archaeology talk."
So what's on your agenda right now? What are you? How big is your to-do list?
So, like I said, I try to balance the have-to-dos with the want-to-dos. So there's probably 70 projects on my desk right now that I must look at before the end of the week. And there's a wide variety of proposed solar facilities and cell towers and DOT construction projects in that pile. But the things that I've been working on kind of on the side that I'm very passionate about is we received a grant from the National Park Service to do an inventory of the sites associated with Martin Luther King's time in Simsbury. And that will also likely involve some archaeology, and I would hope one day create an archaeological preserve. As you've discussed on the show, archaeology to me is so important because it tells the stories that history doesn't always tell. And that doesn't just mean of disenfranchised groups or people, but sometimes the very mundane things that we don't think about. And so in Simsbury is a dormitory where Martin Luther King came to work with a group of students from Morehouse College, and they came to this dormitory every summer. And I wonder what the archaeology can tell us about what that time was like there for them, what types of things they were engaging in. And we know from his letters that he wrote home just how absolutely influential this time was. And on his application to theology school, he described the summer in Connecticut as being his call to service. And so he's written somewhat about the experiences he had. How do their experiences manifest themselves in the material culture?
I find it fascinating that we can, in a span of 3 minutes, it would go back millions of years and we can go back 50 years with the same group of smart people.
It is, one of the things when we started in these careers, the idea of doing 20th century archaeology was laughable to many, many people. And now I think some of the most interesting work that's being done is actually looking at 20th century resources through 1960. I mean, it's as much of a mental change as it is about any questions that are being asked, but it is a reminder that archaeology can be used as a tool to sort of explore just about anything, and productively.
Yeah. I completely agree with that. And the perception of time to me has also been incredibly helpful. We've just finished a long-term project that was funding that came out of after Hurricane Sandy, and a lot of what we were talking about is resiliency and planning for the future, and in 20 years this and 50 years that. And my perspective on it was, do you know what was happening 500 years ago, 5,000 years ago? And it was just a completely different way of looking at the world. I mean, I'm in an office that is based on historic preservation, and yet archaeologists don't look at it the same way. So preservationists are very focused on saving the past for the future, whereas archaeologists are very much about that we are part of a cycle, and that things are always changing and evolving and moving. And so it's not really about preserving for the future, it's preserving now. And it makes everything that we do very contemporary and very relevant.
Sarah, has this been one of the things in your first, what's it been, 30 days actually, probably, right?
15.
Yeah, really. So this is kind of new on how do I work with this office? How do we tag team? How do we author a priority list, a hit list? Because it is a partnership, but with every partnership comes, to use your word, negotiation, actually. I mean, you've got to work and figure out. And we learned something from the Community Foundation in Middlesex County that does a program on our air on Fridays where actually, I say, how do you figure out what you want to do? It's because the first step is figuring out what we don't want to do. Figure out what you're not going to do, what you're not going to apply resource to, because it doesn't make sense. Maybe it's so much easier to do that. Is it a similar situation for you guys?
I mean, I think that it is, but I think that, in a lot of ways we're going to have many of the same goals because we are trying to, preserve and investigate the archaeology of Connecticut. And I think that, my perspective with working more with the public might bring different issues to the table. And those are things that, we'll have to talk about and, like you said, negotiate and try to figure out what the best case scenario is. But I think that, any time when these two offices can be in agreement, I think it's a stronger position. So if we can work towards those goals, I think that would be very productive.
Sounds to me, Cathy, that you're working a lot with the towns.
So I work a lot with towns, but from a different perspective. So I'm working with them whenever they're getting some state or federal guidance or money, whereas Sarah is really working with them hands-on to help change their local plans of conservation development or planning and zoning.
Got it. So for what's next, guys? So we're 15 days. What's the second 15 days look like, Sarah?
At this point, it's really just getting a handle on all the different facets of this job. I've been working with Nick Bellantoni, the emeritus state archaeologist, and he's been introducing me to people and just, bringing me to different situations. I've already started getting phone calls and emails and doing some site visits, so we've kind of dived right in. And it's been great so far, but it's a lot to digest and a lot to think about. But, so far I've had nothing but good experiences. And there really is just a tremendous amount of interest. I mean, even just in a couple of weeks, I've gotten so many phone calls and emails from the public, people that are worried about things in their town, people that have concerns about things on their property, and just working with them, to help them figure out what they have and if it's significant and if it's a thing that can be protected. It's already been pretty rewarding and interesting.
So I'm just on the sideline here, but the piece of the puzzle that seems most interesting to me in terms of making sure that everybody is working together is the piece where there are 169 towns in our state, and I think the number is like only maybe 40 or 50 or 60 of them are actually reporting to the office of any tear downs that are happening, that they that they're not required to do necessarily, but it'd be great if they did, so they could figure out whether the site should be investigated, because we're losing a lot. Look, infrastructure is one of our and the wear and tear on some of these old structures that we have is like one of the biggest challenges. The Stanton House in Clinton, one of the biggest challenges of holding on to these monikers, these icons of our collective arc. They're threatened, and for them to be torn down or what have you. Our friends in Avon saying the greatest threat is just development. Is some of these structures, some of these buildings are being torn down before we can come in and figure out what fruits they might have for us, what nuggets they might have 18 inches deep into the soil. So is that one of the challenges, is trying to figure out how to get more of the 169 towns to actually work in concert with and just let your office know what's going on? Yeah, that's definitely part of it. And, part of the thing that I want to do in my first year is just, reach out to town planners, maybe have some kind of workshop, get people who are interested in learning more about historic preservation and possibly implementing those things in their town, to just come and talk about it and to just, be familiar with me and what my office can do, and hopefully get more people on board with those types of, implementing those types of regulations in their own towns. But, the challenge there is that you have to help people understand that this isn't going to necessarily stop development. The goal isn't to make sure that nothing ever gets built again or nothing ever gets fixed again. It's to make sure that we can do that in a way that also, facilitates preservation or at least investigation or mitigation of the resources that might be lost.
Yeah, I think, part of the battle, so when you talk about a building being torn down, that's very visible. You can see that. And so it's actually a lot easier to get towns behind understanding what their history is in terms of the built environment because they can see it. You would be shocked how many times I talk to a municipal leader and they say, "Oh, really? There's archaeology in this town?" Just completely surprised. And, sometimes in talking about the great sites in this state, the ones that do capture the media and the public's attention, you sometimes miss the stories of all those other sites that have informed archaeologists in being able to talk about the past in meaningful or deep understanding ways.
So you've brought up Avon, Weathersfield, Simsbury. We're talking. Do you have favorite projects or digs in your tenure that you are fascinated with as a fan of archaeology?
So this is where I'm probably a lousy archaeologist. I was never drawn to the research side of archaeology. If you're a student, you tend to take one of two paths, and probably the most desirable one is for people who do research archaeology and stay within academics. I was never actually interested in that. What I liked doing was digging in the dirt and finding stuff. And so I was a very practicing professional kind of archaeologist, and I love what I do because I like making people do the right thing, and love archaeology from a very procedural point of view. What they actually find, as long as they're excited about it, I'm excited about it. That's all I really want. And one of the great pieces of advice that I got early on from Dr. Kevin McBride was, you have to look at every project and find something to like about it, that you're going to learn something from it. And I will say I have carried that through my entire career. And so, even the projects where we don't find anything, I say, you know what? I learned something here. That's not where people wanted to live.
Yeah, there's actually something in nothing.
Yes. Yeah. And so I always try to find, some nugget or something that I can learn from every project that's out there. So I really don't have a favorite.
That's cool. Well, it's great to hang out with you guys. What do we have to look forward to in future episodes? Are we choreographing that together?
Well, this is a transition episode for us. So spring makes us think of new beginnings, and that's certainly true for the Archaeology of Connecticut. This is my last episode as co-host of the show. It is going back to its origins and its intent as the sort of showpiece and bullhorn for the Office of State Archaeology. So we're really thrilled that Sarah's on board now, not just for this show, obviously, but certainly very excited to see what she's going to do in her new position.
Yep, so I'll be back next month with Scott Brady, our regular co-host. He's away this week and couldn't join us today. And we're going to work out a series of topics, for the coming months. We haven't really sorted that out yet, but we'll keep you updated.
Figuring it out. Hey, Cathy, for people who wanted to follow, get in touch, send you emails, and put items on your hit list. You don't want to share it. Can they follow you on Facebook or the organization or?
Yep. If you just Google CT SHPO, SHPO, you'll find me.
There you go. Always been fun hanging out with you guys. If you have comments, questions, you can send them in to info@icrvradio.com. That's info@icrvradio.com. We look forward to having these smart people sitting around the round table around this time next month. Thanks so much for joining us on Archaeology of Connecticut.